Friday to Shabbos versus to return it on Shabbos itself. Yeah. Anyways, that was last week. Now, because we failed to resolve the issue last week, this week we come and we say another Tashma to try and prove one way or the other. This particular Tashma tries to prove the exact opposite. This Tashma tries to prove that it means lahachzir tanan. How does it prove it? As I told you yesterday, machloikis, Rashi, and Tosfos. There's a machloikis between Rashi and Tosfos. Now, I briefly explained the machloikis between Rashi and Tosfos. I did briefly explain it. However, I will be honest with you that this particular Tashma is somewhat difficult. And that's why Rashi and Tosfos argue on what it actually says, because it's a difficult piece of Gemara to understand. And therefore, it will require you to actually sit down, read the Gemara properly, and word for word, and go back and forth, and twist your brain a little bit until you figure out what's going on. And therefore, I'm not going to repeat it over here. We're going to go on to the next Tashma. As we said, that Tashma tried to resolve the issue and failed again to resolve that issue. Right? In other words, we're back to square one. We have an issue. Does the Mishnah mean lahachzir tanan, or does the Mishnah mean lishoisnan? So we say Tashma. Come and listen. Tashma. What does Tashma mean as a keyword? Yaakov, David.
It's an attempted resolution to the previously stated conundrum.
Yeah, and one
and
important
may
detail.
Not succeed at resolving the conundrum.
That's, you said attend, but there's another important detail that you mentioned. That you didn't mention.
It requires either a Tanaic
it's a
opinion
quote.
or
A quote. It's a quote, meaning it's not trying to resolve the issue with a logical argument. It's trying to quote a quote that quote seems to resolve the issue. Right? That's why he says, come and listen. Come and listen. As a matter of fact, when I studied Gemara as a child, they used to make us translate everything into Yiddish. Now, some of the kids actually knew Yiddish, but my parents grew up in America, and they weren't religious growing up. And so they didn't speak Yiddish in the house, so it was difficult for me to understand Yiddish. By now, I pretty much understand Yiddish, right? But when they taught us the Gemara and made us translate it into Yiddish. And you know what we used to say? We said, Tashma kumun her. Kum her, what was it? I'm trying to remember the words. What was it? Kum her? No, kum her.
Come here.
Kum her, ich will bringen a Reihe. That was it. Kum her, ich will dir bringen a Reihe. I'm going to bring you a proof or some type of evidence.
Does the Turikata speak Yiddish?
I don't know. I'm not interested in knowing them. Right? I'm not sure if they're interested in knowing me either.
They speak Yiddish.
Huh?
By the way.
You want to speak Yiddish?
No,
they speak Yiddish. Good. Anyways, so the next Tashma is actually a little bit simpler than the previous Tashma. However, the next Tashma is actually longer. So it's actually a very long quote. And this long quote is going to teach us a lot of important things about Talmudic logic if you listen and pay attention to the longer quote. So again, there's going to be more to analyze, although it'll be a little bit more straightforward, a little bit clearer, a little bit easier to understand. Okay? Good. Toshma, come and listen. We're going to make a quote. We're quoting a Brasadic quote from the Braisa that says as follows. Beis kiris hamasimis. If there are two kiras, what's a kira? A stove. The old-fashioned stoves, they used to have a rectangular type of box. They used to put flammables in it, and they used to put the pots on top. What happens if you have two of these systems right next to each other? Beis kiris hamasimis, two kiras right next to each other, meaning touching each other. or perhaps even shearing the wall. Perhaps they even shear one of their walls. It means adjacent, but I didn't quite see whether it means it shares a wall or not. Yeah, it says over here, Rashi says they're connected. And it says so from Rashi it says there is a wall of cheres, of earthenware that separates the two, which means it seems like they are sharing one wall. Yeah. Good.
Who's sharing a wall?
The two kiras. There's two kiras next to each other. In other words, instead of somebody making a rectangle kira that's like this and putting in flammables, he made a long rectangular kira, but then he split it down the middle with a earthenware wall with clay. Clay is actually one of the more common materials that they used to use for these type of pieces of equipment. They used to make an oven, stoves. They used to make out of clay. Okay, so here you have one long kira, and then you have a wall splitting it down in the middle, right? Beis kiras hamasimis, two kiras, one right after the other. Achas gerufo ktuma, one of them is swept or sprinkled with ashes. Ve'achas she'eino gerufo ktuma, and one is not sprinkled with the ashes. Be'eino ktuma. It says as follows: Mashin al gabe grufa. You're allowed to leave on top of the grufa one, and you're not allowed to leave from Friday to Shabbos on what is not grufa ve'ena ketuma.
Can you give us
All right, we're going to make a picture for David. Yosef. See, we have a lot of Davids here. So get the David and Yosef. Okay, we have David. All right. All right. All right. That is a kira. Okay? That is a kira. And inside of that kira, they used to put flammables, and then they used to put the pot on top. There was one man that decided he's going to make a kira like this, right? So it has kind of like two.
No, it's one that's grufa and ketuma, and the other one's not grufa and ketuma.
Sorry if I'm not the greatest artist, but yeah. I don't know.
there's a wall that goes through there, separating the kiri into two different stoves.
Correct.
What's the point of doing that?
I don't know.
It could be that when you
I have no idea.
If you have a smaller stove, then that will be able to...
No, it doesn't say why you would do this.
If you make the stove smaller, then that could heat up that thing contains...
I'll tell you again, we can guess. We are welcome to guess if you want. Okay, I'll even participate in the guessing game, although it's not necessarily relevant. Why would somebody want to make such a kira? But let's imagine ourselves going back in time, and we have an oven. Today we have a stove, right? Today, if you buy a stove, each one of the burners is a different size. You have one hotter, one cooler, right?
That's right.
So it could be when they were cooking in those days, they would split it in half. This way, if they know they wanted to cook, if they want to have a hotter section and also a heat, they wanted one section to be hot, but not that hot. They had one of the sections they wanted to be hotter than the other.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so they would split it down the middle. They would split it down the middle, and then they would have perhaps a big fire on one side, a smaller fire on the other side. And this way, like today when we're cooking, very often you cook it till it's super boiling, and you want to put it on a low fire to kind of like just to keep it hot.
Yeah.
So that you on Shabbos you can take something off the one that's not been grufa ketuma and put it on the one that is.
No. What we're discussing is for the purposes of cooking food. So one is more of like a warmer one, and one is more of a cooking one.
Again, let's understand the facts. The facts is that this person had this system where he had this cooking device where it had a wall down the middle. Yeah. Now, one of the sides, he left the fire going, and the other side, he did grufo ktuma, which is the other side, he did
either
rake the coals or sprinkled it with ashes.
Right, and then when you rake the coals, is it raking all of them out, so there's no coals left inside the thing?
Yosef is asking a great question, and I wish I had a great answer. There are mefarshim that speak about what exactly it is, and some people say you're meant to try to rake the whole things out. Some people say no, you just have to kind of like rake it to the sides, push it on the sides so that it's a little less active.
The purpose of raking
Yeah.
the coals is to diminish the fire state.
Correct. To diminish the ability that the fire has to impact the food. Correct.
Not necessarily putting it out, but you're diminishing.
Well, the whole point is you want to keep a fire hot.
Right.
Yeah.
You want to keep the fire. It's a way of cooling down the thing. When you go to a bonfire,
Yeah.
and you break up all the coals, when they're not together,
Yeah.
they are going to go out.
There's two other aspects to it also.
Okay, but the point is it's not going to be as hot, and that's the whole point of it. It's not going to be as hot. You're cooling it down. You're diminishing its energy.
Sprinkling the ash will reduce.
Once again, it's going to reduce. It's going to reduce the ability of those coals to impact the food. And as I'm reminding you, the whole reason that we even do this is because we're afraid you're going to stoke the coals in order to heat them up. But if they're so cool, if it's not that hot, your stoking isn't going to do much.
Right.
All right.
Rufa is raking.
Correct.
Ruma is covering with dust.
Correct. Smart guy. Can I know that? All right. Where are we? Again, we said as follows: two kiras connected to each other. One is grufa, one isn't grufa. It says you're allowed to leave on the one that is grufa, but you're not allowed to leave on the one that is not grufa and not tuma. Umahin mashin. And what are you allowed to leave on the one that's grufa kutuma? What are you allowed to leave? Beis Shammai oimrim. Beis Shammai says veloy klum. You cannot leave anything. I'm sorry. In other words, he says you can't leave anything on either one. Beis Hillel says chamin avaloy tafshu. He says hot water you can leave. Beis Hillel says you can leave hot water on the one that isn't grufa kutuma, but you're not allowed to leave food on the one that isn't grufa kutuma. Okar, if it got removed from the kira, divrei hakol lo yachzir, everybody would agree that you're not allowed to put it back. In other words, you're allowed to take it off, but you're not allowed to put it back on Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Now, here is what I want the Talmudic students in this room to do. Okay, if you think you're smart enough to do that. But I want you to think of how does this compare to what we said in the Mishnah? Does this sound consistent with the rules of the Mishnah or not? Why is it not consistent with the rules of the Mishnah, Yosef? Peer pressure. He said you have to be his friend. And
if your answer was yes.
Why? What is inconsistent between that and the Mishnah?
The Mishnah, Beis Shammai says you can leave kamin below tafshil.
Right.
Beis Hillel says you can leave both.
Right.
That's the Mishnah.
Right.
This is different.
So I want to point out to you.
And also the Mishnah doesn't talk about two pots. And the Mishnah doesn't talk about two pots.
It doesn't have two kiras. Two kiras. Yeah. Okay.
Is to leave it or to return it?
Huh?
Tafshil
Tafshil is the food itself. The dish itself is tafshil.
But shiite.
Dish is to leave it. Now, I want to tell you that the Gemara right now, the Talmud is assuming, listen carefully, the Talmud is under the assumption as follows, that this rule is identical rule to the Mishnah, even though you're telling me that they're two attached together, so you'll say, hey, maybe there's a difference because there's two attached together. The Mishnah seems to, the Gemara, at least from its current approach, from the Havamina, is going to approach it as if it is literally the same exact rule of the Mishnah, which means there is no difference whether there's two attached or there's one separate from each other, or each one separate from each other. Yeah? Now, that's what the Gemara is assuming. How do I know this is what the Gemara is assuming? Because I learned further in the Gemara. Very often, you need to learn further in the Gemara in order to understand what's going on here. It is actually quite common for your Talmudic career, Bezrat Hashem, should grow healthy and blossom. But you're, in order to be successful in your Talmudic career, you have to understand something very important. And that is that the Gemara very often talks, and you might say, hey, hold on a second, there's an issue here, and you have to realize that the Gemara is assuming that it's not an issue, and you have to realize that when you're learning it. Okay, now I'm going to tell you guys, which I like sharing, because I like when you see how the Talmud actually affects actual practical brain functioning. Okay, very often when you hear something from somebody else, right? Especially somebody in America, sometimes they're very like, they pinpoint, oh, you said this and you didn't mean that, and you no, this is what you said, this is not what this is it. So, done. You know what I'm talking about? This is what you said. The fact is that speech is part of communication. And when people communicate, very often they use different terminologies that you may have used a different set of words for that same terminology, right? And they use a different set of words. And so you're going to say, hey, I caught you. You basically said something you didn't mean. What's that going to help you? What will help you if you start figuring out how to figure out what they're really trying to say, even if they don't say it. And that's something the Gemara is going to train you how to do a lot, because there's a lot in the Gemara where you have to listen to what the Gemara is saying, and then you're going to be like, hold on a second, what's going on here? What's going on here? It sounds like there's an issue, and you're going to have to be, okay, it sounds like I have an issue, but the Gemara doesn't have that issue.
Is that a bit like answer the person, not the question?
Understand what the person's trying to say, and don't try to use that person's words in order to determine what they're saying. Exactly. Don't listen to the words literally. Listen to what are they really trying to say. Now, this particular Gemara is trying to say that our Mishnah and this ruling is seemingly identical, which means that we're assuming what's the difference if it's attached to one that's not Grufa Ketuma. At the end of the day, this one is Grufa Ketuma. This one is Grufa Ketuma, so therefore you could do what's on the Grufa Ketuma and not on the other one. Now, if we compare it, there's actually two massive differences between what we just read and the Mishnah. Because in the Mishnah, we say, Beis Shammai, does he allow you to leave on a Grufa Ketubah? He just answered. Huh? Oh! You say he allows you to leave hot water on the Grufa Ketubah? This just said that he doesn't let you leave anything on the Grufa. Rabbi Shammai does not let you leave anything, even if it was Grufa Ketubah, doesn't let you leave anything. Which contradicts our Mishnah, number one. Number two is our Mishnah says that Beis Hillel allows you to return, and this one says Beis Hillel doesn't allow you to return. In other words, it seems to contradict our Mishnah in two separate ways. Yeah?
What about Tafshil?
According to this quote that we just had, Beis Hillel doesn't even let you put cooked food. Beis Hillel, when he allows you, it's almost like Beis Hillel in this one is Beis Shammai's opinion over here. Yeah. He basically says that Beis Hillel says what Beis Shammai says in our Mishnah. Now you'll say, how could this be? How could this be that it seems to be contradicting each other? What's the answer? Divrei Rabbi Meir. As I told you in a previous year, Moshe Chaim Leib, you're listening? It's a very important piece of information right now. Shmuel, I'm extremely impressed that you decided to wear tefillin the entire day while you're learning. You know, even when it's Seder, Seder learning, you're putting on tefillin because you want to wear tefillin when you're learning. Yeah. Anyways, as I mentioned in the past, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were some of the earliest Tanaic sages. They were actually in the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, the second temple. They were in that era, and they were about 100 years before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Wow. The people that wrote the Mishnah, no, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. Oh. The people that wrote the Mishnah were actually about 200 years after the temple was destroyed. So you could imagine that the people that wrote the Mishnah were 300 years after Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and they're trying to record the opinions of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and very often they argued on what the opinions of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were, like in this case. That's why it says Divrei Rabbi Meir. This is Rabbi Meir's opinion, which contradicts our Mishnah. Now the Gemara goes on. It says Rabbi Yehuda Oimer. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that's not what they argued. He is saying Beis Shammai Oimer, and Beis Shammai says Chamen avaloi tafshu. Beis Shammai says that you're allowed to leave on the Grufa or Ketuma hot water, but not food. Beis Hillel Oimer, Beis Hillel says Chamen v'tafshu, you're allowed to put anything on the Grufa or Ketuma. Beis Shammai Oimer, and Beis Shammai says Noitun avaloi machzirin, you can remove it, but you cannot put it back. Beis Hillel Oimer af machzirin. Now, If you listen to Rabbi Yehuda and compare it to the Mishnah, what does it sound like? Don't look at me like that. Look in the Gemara and try to figure out what I'm saying. You want me to tell you all the information? I want you to find the information.
Rabbi,
You want to come to my class for the rest of your life? I'm fine with that, but
Rabbi, can you
I don't know if
repeat
you
that
should be
again?
fine with that. You want you to be able to give the class.
Rabbi, can you repeat that again?
Again, reading Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, how does that compare with the rules of our Mishnah? Huh? How does that compare with the rules of our Mishnah? Yosef, you have your set of sheets, or you should bring your notes.
You're saying the same thing as we're in the Mishnah.
Oh, the same thing. Now, if you look at Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, it seems to be identical to our Mishnah. Okay, Rabbi Meir's opinion seems to be contrary to the rulings of our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion seems to be identical to the Mishnah. Right? Now, this is the end of the quote. Remember, we had Tashma, it brings this quote. Right? Now, look carefully. Yeah.
So Teshma quote always follows. Do we always? Is the end of the quote always going to be like a new key phrase, or will it ever just?
Not always, because sometimes the quote is clearly disproving or proving what we want to prove. And sometimes after the quote, we're going to begin an analysis. Now, if we're going to begin an analysis, usually there are keywords to indicate the initiation of an analysis, like these keywords, which we also had last week as well. Iamat bishlema. If you're going to say, what does Iamat bishlema mean, Yosef? Huh? Oh, it's opening a deductive reasoning. In other words, it's going to say one thing makes sense, one thing doesn't make sense. If you want, you can say the follows, which makes sense. That our Mishnah is leaving. Masnisin Mani, who is the author of a Mishnah? Rabbi Yehuda. It is Rabbi Yehuda. But if you're going to say Lahachsirtan, Masnisin, our Mishnah Mani, Loy Rabbi Yehuda, but Loy Rabbi Meir is neither Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Meir.
But before we said it was Rabbi Hanina.
Huh?
You said before it was Rabbi Hanina.
We did not say it's Rabbi Hanina. We asked if it is Rabbi Hanina. We don't know if it's Rabbi Hanina.
Hanina he.
Huh?
It says Hanina he.
Again, that is a we asking, is it Loylach Sidran? And if that was the case, it would be Rabbi Hanina. We have not yet determined who our Mishnah is like. Now, I want to remind you that if you reread, and I want you to reread the words inside, the Rabbi Meir's opinion and Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing as to what the argument of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel was. Only Jews could come up with such a whacked up concept that there's an argument, whether or not there's an argument, sometimes. By the way, this Gemara is not. But there are other Gemaras that there's an argument, whether there's an argument. And here, actually everybody agrees there's an argument. They're just disagreeing on what the argument is. Right? So at least they agree there's an argument. But if you look at the wording of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, you can clearly see that Rabbi Meir is definitely not consistent with our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda is exactly consistent with our Mishnah, but only if it's Lishay Tanan. Now, there's a general rule in the Gemara that we do not assume there's an argument unless we know this as a fact. We don't assume there's an argument. Why not? Because believe it or not, everybody says there's two Jews, there's three opinions, and everybody thinks that the Talmud is all about arguments. I hate to break it to you, Ariel Margolis. I hate to break this to you, but a majority of Torah, everybody agrees on. I don't know. You actually recorded that?
Yeah,
he recorded that and
too,
shared it.
I had to.
He's sharing. Anyways, most of Judaism, the rabbis agree. And the only reason why people think otherwise is because they're constantly looking at the arguments. Right? I've shared this mushal in the past. And I'll share it again, Yosef. If there was a professor that came to his class, and behind him there was a big whiteboard, and his professor took a black magic marker and put 3 dots on the blackboard. And he asked his students, "What do you see?" And one student raised his hands and says, "I see 3 dots." And the professor said, "Okay, what another student, what do you see?" "I see a triangle," because he made the dots in a triangle. He went through 10, 15 students, everybody saw a different thing. And he looks at his students and he says, "Everybody noticed the 3 black dots. No one realized that the whole board is white. There's only a few little black dots on it. There's a whole wall that's white. There's 3 little, if you can count, 1 in billions upon billions of, if you literally take a big whiteboard and you put 3 black dots on it, it's literally, those black dots are the size of maybe 1 trillionth, no, not so much, maybe 1 millionth or 10 millionth of the board was taken up by these 3 black dots, and that's all you see." Exactly.
This is what do you see on the board? And everyone's like 3 black dots.
He's like, "What about the whole whiteboard?"
It's like, why focus on that?
I missed the whole
I
whiteboard.
had a patient come to me and they said, "My foot hurts." I said, "Why do you focus on what's good in your life?"
Oh.
And
You're a doctor? You're a doctor?
You're a podiatrist. I said, "Yes."
What's a podiatrist?
The foot doctor.
Oh, you're actually a foot doctor? I didn't even know that.
That's your job. That's your job. I said, "Yes." I said, "You come to me, like, why are you focusing on what's not working? You got to focus on what is working. So much of your life is working, and you focus on one thing that's not." And they're like, it makes sense what he's saying, but
like my doctor got in
there.
Good. See, we'll send you, if your foot ever hurts, you go to this doctor over here, and you'll be good. All right.
Could you break my toes for me?
I don't know. You have to ask him. He wants you to break his toes.
I want you to break my toes.
You'll have to ask where a past make has.
All right.
Anyways, let's get back to what we're saying. Most of Judaism, everybody agrees. Everybody agrees. You go to every single rabbi in history, you say, "Are you allowed to light a fire on Shabbos?" No. No.
What about driving a car?
Not allowed. No.
But it's work. It's driving a car. It's easier than walking. Walking is
work. So you know what, Rabbi Yosef, you actually missed my introduction class to Shabbos. Okay? There is no prohibition whatsoever to work on Shabbos. It doesn't exist. It's a mistranslation, a misquote, and fake news. There is no prohibition whatsoever to work on Saturday, to work on the Sabbath. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah, do not work on Saturday. I know they say, ain't going to work on Saturday. I'm like, why not? Why not? Why not work on Saturday? It doesn't say anywhere to not work on Saturday. What it says there is, do not do melacha. Lo yisa'aseh kol melacha. The word melacha is craft. It's not. The word melacha is craft and not work. Craft means that you're actually making one thing into the next. That's called craft. Work is when you exert energy to a project. That's called work, right? You are allowed to exert energy into many projects on Shabbos, as long as you're not crafting, you're not taking this pen and turning it into something else. And when, for example, when you light a fire, you're automatically taking the fuel and turning it into energy, which means you're switching. You're changing its dimension, and it's the same thing because did God work on Saturday? Of course He worked on Saturday, because we hold in the Kabbalah that God recreates everything every second. He recreates everything every second.
Wow.
No actuality, because the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya that if God stopped continuously creating all reality, it would go poof and disappear, and it would be as if it never was, which means even historically it wouldn't be there. Even the fact that something exists in the past is because God's constantly creating it, even in the past. So God was working on Saturday. What wasn't he doing on Saturday was craft. What's craft is changing something. When on Sunday he changed this world and this reality into something else. On Monday there was a new addition to the change, the functioning of this world. And Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, each day there was a new type of function in this world. Just like when you craft, you take a piece of wood and you turn it into a table. It used to be a piece of wood, now it's a table. Right? And that's why we're not allowed to do craft on Shabbos, because we're not allowed to take one thing and change it into something else. And every single malacha is about taking actually it's taking a physical piece of equipment and making it into something else. That's called a craft, and that is what's prohibited on Shabbos. There is no prohibition whatsoever to work on Shabbos. It doesn't exist, and that's why these Reformed people say, drive on Shabbos, it's easy, it's not working. I'm like, who said you can't work on Shabbos? Right? What's wrong with working on Shabbos? Nothing wrong with working on Shabbos. They say, if I walk to shul, it's more work. I said, Shekoyach, so who told you not to work on Shabbos?
So malacha is defined as crafting,
As taking a physical reality and changing it into something else.
using the application of your intelligence and creative skill to change one.
It's not your brain skill, it's your physical ability to do an action. It's basically to do an action to transform some physical reality. Yes. That's what malacha means. You're using your physical abilities to transform reality into something that it wasn't prior to Shabbos. That is malacha. Anything else is not malacha. Right? As a matter of fact, I don't want to get into this, but there's the Gemara in the beginning of Hilchei Shabbos. It actually discusses why it is prohibited to take from a private domain to a public domain. Why is that prohibited? It doesn't seem like you're doing anything. It's the same pen was here, now it's here. And it's a deep discussion, and it ends up saying that this one melacha it's a gezeres hakosov. God is saying that somehow when you transfer something from one domain to the next, it actually changes its whatever it is. It is a change. And that's the only one. All the other 38 melachas, you can clearly see an active change. You're not allowed to plow a field, because now that it's plowed, then it's a plowed field. Before it wasn't plowed. If you seed, you're putting seeds in the ground that are now going to grow. Without putting it in the ground, it won't grow. Right? Now it's going to grow and become something. Right? So every single one of the 39 melachas are prohibited on Shabbos are actually crafts, not work. Okay, so anybody told you that you cannot work on the Sabbath, they're wrong. There is no prohibition whatsoever to work on Sabbath. You're allowed to work as hard as you want. Again, it might not be in the spirit of Sabbath, depending on what type of work it is.
The significance of the spirit of the Sabbath.
That's exactly. We're commemorating God's stopping from crafting the world. That's commemoration.
Is that one of the malachas to
what?
In the spirit of Shabbos?
No.
Is that a prohibition? Is that
I don't know what you're talking about. No, rabbinically, there's various. The rabbis basically came up with various different rules that enable you to have the Shabbat spirit, and there are various rabbinic rules that were built for that reason. Yeah.
So the Shabbos spirit is rabbinic.
And by the way, you should know that it actually they're biblical. It says that Shabbos is about rest, and oineg, and what's this? What are you listening to? Huh? What's going on? If somebody else that's more interesting than me, let him come. Let him come and give this shit. Huh?
You're the best, Baba.
Not possible.
Impossible.
Yeah. What? Who? Menucha. Oineg. Yeah, menucha. Oineg. Menucha and oineg. There is a thing. There is a concept where Shabbos is also about resting, like having a resting time, etc. But again, that doesn't mean that the whole Shabbos you need to rest. You should have some rest on Shabbos, but there are certain things that are work.
Right? Shomer doesn't sleep. Shomer Shabbos, you don't sleep on Shabbos.
Wow. But then you're not doing menucha.
You have a menucha when you're being a shomer.
I don't know what you're talking about. Anyways, let's continue. Yes. We're going down a rabbit hole over here. We gotta end soon.
There's a YPD 6 years ago who
Yeah.
he loved running. Like he's a runner. Every
Yeah.
single day he goes on a run.
Yeah.
That's just part of how he lives life. And I remember there was a question of can he do that on Shabbos? And the answer he got was it's not in the spirit of Shabbos to go on a run.
Right.
Unless you're not doing it like for exercise, maybe if you're really just doing it because it just brings you pleasure.
You're going to shul.
So things like that, I think that's kind of what he was asking. Things like that, are those...
Put it this way: there are certain things that the rabbis set in place that we're not allowed to do. By the way, if you know muksa, the whole concept of muksa is rabbinical, right? And the reason for the concept of muksa is because they felt that what they said is that there are some people. We always have those people in every generation, even back in the time of the Gemara. We had those people that they would call in Australia bludgers. You know what a bludger is? You don't know what a bludger? What's a bludger?
Well, it depends what sort. They got the
What's a bludger?
Bludger is someone that doesn't do much and just leeches everyone else.
Yeah, somebody who just hangs around and just sleeps all day and gets up and goes out to the street and asks somebody else for a cigarette. Could I have this? Could I have that? Basically, he does nothing with his life, and he just it's a bludger, right? In America, we call him a lazy bum. A lazy bum. Yeah. Yeah, Shimon wants to show off his lazy bum.
Getting bigger now.
Getting bigger. That's what happens if you don't do much.
Rabbi, you ever met a bludger?
I've met people that Australians call bludgers. Yeah. Anyways, so listen carefully. The rabbis basically said that because there are lazy people that don't do anything a whole week, if they would also do nothing, if we would let them do certain things on Shabbos, they'll say, you know what? I'll do nothing during the week, and come Shabbos, I'm going to start schlepping things from back and forth. I'm going to organize my stuff. And the rabbis felt that wouldn't be the right thing. So they made certain rules to ensure that Shabbos doesn't become a day like in America. They say, what do they do on Sunday? They mow their lawn, right? They go to church for 2 hours and they mow their lawn, and they save all their household chores for Sunday, right? God says, no, that's not Shabbos. Well, the rabbi said that's not Shabbos. Shabbos, you don't save your choice for Shabbos. You try to do your choice during the week, and then Shabbos is your day. It's almost your day to reflect and to focus, right? And that's what the rabbi said, and therefore there's many rules that the rabbis said in order to prevent this atmosphere from coming, and some of these are there. But again, I don't want to get derailed onto a discussion about every halach on Shabbos except for what the Gemara did. I know that I said in the past that if you come to my class, you learn everything except for the Gemara says. I said that in the past, but that was last term. This term, we're making a change. We're going to try our best not to get derailed onto topics that are not relevant to our Gemara. All right? If you were here in last term, maybe you would. We're not discussing the spirit of Shabbos because it's not relevant to the topic that we're learning in the Gemara. It's not in the spirit of the Gemara shir. Tashma. This Tashma. Anyways, as I said, Tashma. As I said as follows. Okay? Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda have an argument. And because they have an argument, the Gemara is going to assume, Yosef, the Gemara is going to assume that if they have an argument and it does not mention anyone else having this argument, the Gemara is automatically going to assume that these are the only two opinions, because why would we assume that there's a third opinion? Again, we always assume that the rabbis agree unless we know otherwise. Now, over here, we clearly see Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda argue, because it's absolutely clear that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing. However, why would you think that anybody else argues? Why would you even think that there's another person that argues? So the Gemara then basically says, if that's the case, Rabbi Meir clearly is inconsistent with our Mishnah, and so therefore our Mishnah clearly cannot be Rabbi Meir. And then he says, however, it could be consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. And if it's consistent with Rabbi Yehuda, let's assume that it's consistent with Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore it is a proof that Lisha Ishtanan. Right? Let's read this analysis in the words. Yeah. It would make sense to say that we're talking about. Lishois Masnisin Mani, who is the Tana of our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah is basically Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. However, if you're going to say that it's about returning it, Mani, who is the opinion of our Mishnah, Loi Rabbi Yehuda v'Loi Rabbi Meir, it would not be Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir kasher lebeis Shami b'chadol lebeis Hillel b'tarti. If it's according to Rabbi Meir, you'll find one inconsistency with Beis Shammai's opinion and two inconsistencies with Beis Hillel's opinion. And by the way, I want you to count them. I'm not going to explain them in shir because I want you to try to figure out yourself. But if you were to go with Rabbi Meir's opinion, you will find one inconsistency with Rabbi Beis Shammai's opinion, two inconsistencies with Beis Hillel's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda, if you were going to say it's Rabbi Yehuda, kasha grufa ketuma, it is a question about grufa ketuma. Clearly, where if you're going to say lahachzer tanan, you're allowed to leave it for grufa. You're allowed to leave it even if it was not grufa ketuma, and therefore that contradicts Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so therefore, in other words, the Gemara basically says that our Mishnah doesn't. If you're going to say lishis nan, you can argue, okay, our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, right? But if you're going to say lahachzer tanan, then it's neither, and that wouldn't make sense. Because we'd assume that if we have an argument between two rabbis, let's assume that they're the only two rabbis that are arguing. Yeah, so the Gemara actually says as follows: I can still say that it actually means la'achzer tanan. Tana didan, and the Tana of our Mishnah shavar lak Rabbi Yehuda b'chada. He agrees with Rabbi Yehuda in one instance, upalig aleh b'chada, and he disagrees with him in another instance. Savalak Rabbi Yehuda b'chada b'cham v'tavshim leitu machzirim. Pulig aleh b'chada diu Tana didan savar lishos v'ava pisheni gurav v'kutuma v'Rabbi Yehuda savar lishos nami garav v'katam in loy. In other words, the Gemara then plugs in. So the Gemara does something super, super rare, right? It does something super, super rare, which means it guesses that there's a third opinion that we don't know about. Remember what I told you, we never try to assume there's an argument. Right? We usually try to say that there's no argument. So if we have one argument between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, we'll assume they're the only ones arguing. Why would we guess that there's a third person arguing? Our Gemara says, yes, there's a hypothetical, anonymous third person, perhaps, that's arguing. Now, why would the Gemara stretch out on a limb so far? Why would it do that, Ariel? You have no idea? That's the best answer that you could have got, unless you don't know what the Gemara says. Because if I didn't learn the Gemara and the Rashi and the Tosfos and try to really understand it well, I wouldn't either have any idea. But as I mentioned, I think in a previous year, is you can see that the Gemara actually has a strong agenda to prove that it means loy lahachzer tanan. It has an agenda. And that's also why, if you remember, I told you, why did we reorganize the Mishnah? Why reorganize the Mishnah? Just resolve the issue, right? We have an issue. Doesn't mean option A or doesn't mean option B, right? So we proved option A was correct, so let's just leave it and walk away. Why we're reorganizing a Mishnah? Why, again, before, in the first Tashma, we reorganized a Mishnah just to legitimize Leil Achzer Tanan. Why would we do that? Why would we want to do that? As a matter of fact, as Ariel knows from yesterday, that when we said we don't even have people arguing here. There's no argument over here. There's no argument. We don't have any rabbi fighting the other rabbi. We just have two options, right? If we have two options, then why do we need to reorganize the Mishnah? Let's just leave the option that's consistent with the Mishnah and not reorganize the wording of the Mishnah. Here too, even though we say that there's two people arguing, and we never in a Gemara do we say there's a third person arguing, all of a sudden we come and say there's a third person arguing. Why are we doing that? You can clearly see the Gemara's agenda to say Leil Achzer Tanan, and the Gemara actually, the Tosfos actually explains this. I think I briefly explained it in the Tosfos class. We went through it deeply, but there is a reason why the Gemara is pushing the envelope on Lahachzer Tanan, because there's strong reason for the Gemara to believe that it's Lahachzer Tanan, because otherwise there would be a lot of other conflicts within the Mishnah. Later on, it shows that there's two Mishnahs that would seem to contradict each other. And if we would say that Lishishnan, we would have two Mishnahs conflicting with each other, and that wouldn't make sense. Now, because we have such a strong reason to believe that it's Lahachsirtanan, therefore the Gemara is going to go out on a limb and say, you know what? Maybe there's a third opinion that we don't know about. And again, you have to understand this in Talmudic logic, because otherwise we wouldn't have said it. Huh? Kasha literally means like a question or a difficulty, which means that in English, contextually, we see it there's a conflict. There's a conflict between the Mishnah and here. Yeah. Yeah, there's a conflict between the two. You know, I got a comment from nobody over here. Yeah, that's what they write. Nobody. That's what they call themselves. Comment. I got a comment from nobody. Shimon. Oh, you wrote that? You put that up? You're nobody?
Sometimes.
Are you nobody?
What platform is this?
This is a thing that he has, and it goes into different.
Yeshiva platform?
No. This we go on to different. It's going to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Kick. And X. Can I know? Anyways, we love you guys. We have to go to the shir. We have to go to Chavrusas. I'm begging you guys, if you don't want to do yourself a favor, do me a favor. Read it over and over and over till you understand it, because our shir today gave you a little bit of a clue of what's going on, but I promise you do not understand it until you read the Gemara properly. It's impossible. Even if you listen to the shir and understood every word I said, you're probably not getting the true intricacies that are going on over here. All right? Good. Nobody says it's Mashiach. Mashiach, can I know that? What are you waiting for? You should come and bring Mashiach already. There. Anyways, that's the end of the shir. We have to end right now because I need to go and you need to learn. I mean, I don't need to leave. We need to learn. And I'm going to start by having our dear friend Yaakov is going to come first, and then Yosef. Why Yaakov, then Yosef? Because Yaakov was Yosef's father. So he goes first. Yeah. Very interesting because I have a daughter, Rachel,